Welcome back to the Hazmat Files, the podcast where we explore hazardous materials, emergency response, and transportation-related risks impacting our communities and first responders. I'm your host, Erica Fisher. Today's episode focuses on a rapidly expanding energy source that presents unique challenges for the emergency response community: hydrogen. As hydrogen is increasingly used in transportation, energy storage, and industrial applications, first responders must be prepared to recognize its hazards, respond safely, and protect their communities. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guest and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of TransCare or its sponsoring organizations. The content provided is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal or professional advice. Joining us today is Dr. Christina Baxter, a nationally recognized expert in hazardous materials and CBRNE emergency response. Dr. Baxter was a co-founder of Hazard3, a hazmat CBRNE training company that was acquired by Safeware Inc. in 2023. Prior to Hazard3, she served as the CBRNE Program Manager for the U.S. Department of Defense Combating Terrorism Technical Support Office, where she was responsible for developing and fielding both domestic and international next-generation capabilities for the CBRNE counterterrorism response elements. Dr. Baxter holds a PhD in analytical chemistry from the Georgia Institute of Technology and brings more than 25 years of experience in hazardous materials and CBRNE response. She remains actively engaged in teaching, research, and standards development with a strong focus on translating science into practical guidance for first responders. Together, we'll take a closer look at the unique challenges of hydrogen, how responders can safely manage these incidents, and what responders should be thinking about before an incident occurs. Dr. Baxter, to set the foundation for our listeners, let's start with the basics. What are the key chemical and thermal properties responders need to understand most about hydrogen?
Well, there's several different ones that we need to look at. First, hydrogen's a gas at standard temperature and pressure because its boiling point is so low. And it has a vapor density that's less than 1, so it's going to rise in air. So that's the good news. The bad news is it's generally stored under pressure as a gas or as a cryogenic liquid. And if that liquid were to release, it has an expansion ratio of around 850, which creates a big hazard for asphyxiation. The flammable range as well is concentration range in air that it's going to burn is between 4 and 75%. So it's got a very wide flammability range. And it's got to have that vapor or it's not going to burn at all. So the liquid itself won't burn. The detonation range, which is a subset of the flammability range, that's the range where the combustion wave can propagate supersonically via a shock wave. That's from 18.3 to 59%. So a range that's larger than most chemicals' flammable range alone is the detonation range for hydrogen. So that could be quite problematic as well. And the other thing that I like to remind people is that the ignition energy of hydrogen is very low. It's in the order of 0.017 millijoules in air. And when you think about that, to put it into perspective, if it was 3 millijoules in air, it would be considered extremely sensitive. If it were 30 millijoules, it would be highly sensitive. So we're at 0.017 millijoules in air. So we are dealing with a material that is extremely, extremely sensitive. To me, those are some of the major chemical and physical properties that we need to keep in mind when dealing with hydrogen.
And building upon those, what are some of the potential risks or consequences of a hydrogen leak, fire, or explosion?
I guess I like to divide it out to a couple of different things. So flammability and explosivity, asphyxiation hazards, cryogenic nature, and then the ability to detect it. I'll go through each one of these a little bit more. In terms of flammability and explosivity, we have to remember that hydrogen is a highly flammable, odorless, and colorless gas. This makes it extremely difficult to detect and extremely dangerous. It has that wide flammable range that we talked about and that very low ignition energy. This means that even the smallest of sparks or static electricity or even a hot surface nearby can ignite that hydrogen air mixture. In a confined space, this also can create an explosive atmosphere, leading to a vapor cloud explosion or a flash fire pretty quickly. In terms of asphyxiation, the hydrogen leaks that are in an enclosed area or a poorly ventilated area can displace oxygen quickly with that 850 to 1 expansion ratio, and that creates an asphyxiation hazard. And then from a cryogenic nature, generally because it is a gas, it tends to be stored under cryogenic conditions under great pressure as a liquid. That means that we have an extremely low temperature. A leak can cause frostbite or cryogenic burns on the skin. And then it can also degrade the metals nearby. So we start looking at the mechanical properties, some of the pipes and things around, storage tanks, all of that can get embrittlement hazards. And then what I consider one of the biggest hazards to us is it's really hard to detect. When you start thinking about flames and fire, we're used to dealing with radiant heat. But hydrogen burns with a very low radiant heat because it doesn't have carbon or soot. So those soot particles are the things that actually broadcast the heat in the natural world. But with this, we have hot gases like water vapor and hydroxyl radicals. We don't have those solids, so they're very poor radiators of heat. And then finally, it's that invisible flame. Like a methanol flame, a hydrogen flame is really pale blue and almost invisible to the naked eye, especially in daylight. So if you have any sun around you, you're not going to see this flame. So you don't have the heat from the flame and you can't see the flame. So you've got to start thinking about the other ways that you can detect this. Thermal imaging cameras, fantastic tool to have available. The other one is a carbon monoxide sensor because those are cross-sensitive to hydrogen. So we can detect it using CO sensors and we can detect the flame and temperature using our thermal imager. And that will allow us to stay safe with those types of materials.
Now that we have an understanding of some of the risks of hydrogen, where are first responders most likely to encounter hydrogen today? In transportation, fixed facilities, or somewhere else?
Unfortunately, yes. So the answer is you're going to find hydrogen everywhere in industry, but you're also going to find it in the energy sector and used for transportation as part of that energy sector. From an industry perspective, hydrogen's used as a chemical feedstock. So it's used to produce ammonia. It's used to produce methanol. So any of those areas that are producing ammonia and methanol around the United States or any other area is going to have hydrogen feedstock. It's also used in the petroleum industry. If you're using it just in a petroleum to remove the impurities like sulfur and nitrogen, you'll see it there. But you'll also see it in those hydrocracking areas to break down those heavy long-chain hydrocarbons as well. So in crude oil. Any of those areas that are petroleum refining or that are getting the crude oil will have hydrogen. It's also used in a lot of places to, we'll call it decarbonization of industry. In areas where they're trying to get to high temperatures, to get away from using those carbon materials, they're switching over to hydrogen. And then, of course, it's used in food processing, metallurgy, electronics, all of those areas. In the energy sector, it's used in power generation for fuel cells. It's also used in combustion turbines. One thing that I think is really interesting about hydrogen is often used as an energy storage tool. Because of its properties, it's able to hold energy very well and then be stored that way and converted back to electricity at the time of need. And then finally, it's starting to be seen in heating in both residential and commercial places. And that obviously has some concerns as well. But in terms of transportation, you're seeing it a lot and mainly in the larger vehicle space. So those vehicles as an alternative fuel that have a long range, require fast refueling, and have heavy payloads. Hydrogen is a fantastic fuel for those scenarios. So you're starting to see more and more of the large vehicles switching over to hydrogen.
And looking more into the transportation mode, what are the specific hazards of hydrogen being used as a fuel?
We have to remember, again, it's really highly flammable, it's odorless, it's colorless, it's difficult to detect, which makes it really dangerous to us from an emergency response perspective. Remember, again, can't see the flames. So unless they're burning something else that gets carbon and soot, you won't see that. You won't see that smoke. So you really need to have that thermal imager out and available. Hydrogen stored under pressure. All of those different cylinders that are used for storage, and remember, all the cylinders are going to change type based upon the size of the storage capacity. You need to understand the safety considerations for each of those. The one nice thing about it is a cryogenic liquid comes out, it's going to freeze the water molecules in air and give us that white cloud, which isn't the hydrogen, it's the frozen water molecules. But that will only last so long. Then we have to start worrying about that expansion ratio of 850 to 1 and knowing that it's cold coming out, which means it's going to stick to those low-lying areas to begin with until it warms up to the temperature of the environment. Then it's going to rise. So we start talking about the vapor density. Remember, that's at standard room temperature. So as this comes out, it's super cold. So it sticks to the ground for a length of time, causing asphyxiation hazards in low-lying areas, and then slowly warms up and moves its way out.
We've discussed the properties, risks, and where responders may encounter hydrogen in their community. From your experience, what are the most important pre-planning considerations fire departments need to take in jurisdictions with hydrogen production, storage, or fueling infrastructure?
I think the biggest to me will always remain with the hydrogen flames and the fact that you can't see them and you often can't feel the radiant heat. So there needs to be specific training on hydrogen, all of its specific hazards, its properties, where it's going to go, its expansion ratio, operational protocols. What are you going to do? How are you going to detect it? Get those thermal imagers out and use them. And then specific emergency procedures. I think any area that has hydrogen in use, which is across the United States, it's not something that's really simple into one area. While it's got the highest concentration in California because of a lot of different vehicle types out there, it's still used everywhere. So we need to have comprehensive hydrogen emergency response plans. And with that, you need to know, first off, where is that shutoff switch? How do we stop the source of hydrogen from coming further? And then what are the evacuation protocols that need to be in place around that facility for dealing with the hydrogen?
What role does training play in reducing responders' risks to hydrogen emergencies? Where do you also see some of the biggest gaps related to hydrogen emergency response training today?
I say the biggest gap out there today is understanding that it even exists as an alternate fuel. We have a lot of folks out there that are playing catch up still on lithium ion batteries. Okay, we don't want to be in that same place. We don't want to be playing catch up where we're learning as we're responding. We need to get ahead of this. We already have it out there. So how are we going to deal with this safely and responsibly for our community? And really with that is understanding that it's out there. It's got the highest density on the West Coast, but it's out there across the entire country, and making sure people understand those hazards, what they're going to do, and if they don't have the capability internally, who are they going to call?
If you could recommend one preparedness action every fire department should take related to preparing for hydrogen emergencies, what would that be?
I guess to me, it's going to be train on those risks associated with hydrogen. If you can't recognize it, you can't respond to it.
Now let's talk about response. When crews arrive at the scene of a suspected hydrogen incident, what are some of the immediate actions that should take place to secure the scene?
So I like to look at hydrogen vehicles just the same way I look at vehicles that are any type of fuel cell or electric vehicle. Identify, immobilize, utilize the emergency response guides, isolate the battery, perform rescue operations, and then a damage assessment. So to do that, first thing is identifying. We want to identify a vehicle that is a fuel cell electric vehicle. There are some different standards out there. SAE International has probably the most widely used. But with that one, any vehicle that's powered by hydrogen is supposed to have some type of marking on the rear bumper or trunk, on the fascia or hood, and also on the vehicle sides. You could also always go to the fueling receptacle. The fueling receptacle will tell you the fuel type and the maximum pressure for that vehicle. Remember, different vehicles have different pressures as well for hydrogen. And then also understanding that safety information that's provided. When we get to immobilize, just like any electric vehicle, and actually most of this is any vehicle at all, shift it into park, turn the vehicle off and isolate those high pressure and high voltage systems. This may take a few minutes to discharge, so don't think that you can just automatically jump in once you've isolated those systems. Chalk your wheels in both directions to make sure that you're not going to have the vehicle moving forward or back. Get that key fob out of it. Most vehicles that are hydrogen operated will have a key fob because they're more new. So they will have a key fob. Get it at least 20 feet away from the car so that it cannot interact with the vehicle. And then after you have unlocked any doors, opened windows, moved seats, adjusted the steering wheel, anything that you may need to do later, make sure you do that first and then disconnect that 12-volt battery, because that's what operates all of those ancillary types of materials. When you go to the vehicle-specific emergency response guides, there are fantastic resources out there for this. I like to just send people right to the National Highway Transportation Administration's online repository, and you can go to www.nhtsa.gov hazardous.gov, and that will provide you with those resources that you need. And you just need to look up each vehicle with its identity, and you'll be able to find the very specific guidelines from the manufacturer. So the next step is isolating the battery. You need to determine if you need to isolate the battery first. Follow the manufacturer's specific guidance, conduct the shutdown. Remember that shutdown may be as simple as pulling a fuse or a plug. It may be a service disconnect, which is generally hidden a little bit from us, or it could be a cut loop. All of those things are in play. And so you need to understand what each would look like and where you'd find it. And then when you perform those rescue operations, make sure you go back to the guidebook and make sure you know where those high strength and no cut zones are, because you don't want to waste your time on those areas. And frankly, you don't want to go near the cut zones because those are usually high voltage, a hydrogen line, a gas strut, something that we definitely want to avoid. And then the damage assessment. That's oftentimes what people don't follow through on, is what is that damage assessment that we need to do? You want to make sure that you've fully evaluated the high voltage system, the EV battery module, which is still there just like any electric vehicle, the hydrogen tank, make sure there's no impingement on that tank, and then any evidence anywhere of a thermal event, because that can have radiant heat effects, all those other types of effects. So that's the process that I use for any electric vehicle, a few extra additions in there because it's hydrogen generated electricity.
As we discussed, hydrogen flames can be almost impossible to see, especially in the daytime, and they behave differently than hydrocarbon fires. How should this influence tactical decision-making and responder positioning during incidents?
Well, one of the things that you have to think about right away is, just like a CNG response, there's thermally activated pressure relief devices. So when you're starting to put the fire out, you're going to have to worry about where those thermally activated pressure relief devices are, because we don't want to stop their actuation by putting cold water on the relief device. We want to avoid those locations. It may take up to 5 minutes for that tank to fully empty. If we can, remember, these tanks are situated such that the flame is going to shoot down below the car and kind of out a little bit. Avoid the flame where it's going to come out. But if we can, let it go. Let that material burn off. Most effective when we apply the water directly to the cells. You can knock down any active flame with a large amount of water. But remember, if it's the hydrogen burning and we haven't been able to shut off the material, we want to keep that burning so we can actually see it with our thermal imager and where it is. Once you've done that, underbody nozzles and submersion, just like you have with electric vehicles, can work to cool down the battery if it's still involved following the hydrogen release. Thermal cameras, fantastic way to evaluate and monitor the temperature of the battery until the signs of active fire have completely subsided. Remember that your CO sensor may not be as helpful here. You're going to have that hydrogen cross sensitivity pushing it down, but you're also going to have CO coming off of other materials burning. So you can't just rely upon that. You'll need to use a combination of a CO sensor and your thermal imager and rule things out. If the temperature continues to rise, just keep cooling.
What are some of the critical safety considerations around personal protective equipment that responders should be aware of when dealing with hydrogen emergencies?
One of my pet peeves, okay? Your SCBA should be on when you exit the truck. I don't care if it's a regular internal combustion engine, it's an electric vehicle, it's any of those. Each one of those is producing chemicals that you do not want in your lungs. Therefore, SCBA all the way, all the time. Okay. The other thing is your turnout gear should be on and fully engaged. You want to ensure that even though your turnout gear is not providing a lot of chemical protection, it does provide you a limited protection factor to minimize the amount of material that's deposited on your skin and to lengthen the time that it gets to your skin. And if you are dealing directly with the cryogenic material, your turnout gear is not enough. You need to have specific gloves and things for handling refrigerated or cryogenic liquids.
Once the immediate hazard is controlled, are there any post-incident risks responders should be aware of related to hydrogen?
Well, remember, we have to start thinking again about hydrogen not having the ability to give us that radiant heat signature and also not giving us a lot of other information. So I'm going to keep my thermal imager out, and I'm probably going to wait for a length of time, and I'm talking 15-minute intervals. I'm probably going to use 15-minute intervals, continuously monitoring and measuring, making sure that I'm not getting a thermal signature before I agree that that's out. And then CO sensors, wait for those to start to go down. It does take a little bit extra time, but it gives you that little bit of sense of confidence that the cylinder is no longer impinged. And you want to ensure that the area is ventilated and that no rekindling can occur.
As we wrap up today, is there a key message you would like first responders to take away from today's episode on hydrogen emergency response?
I guess to me, we have the tools we need. We already have CO sensors. We already have thermal imagers. Understanding how they apply here, understanding how hydrogen is used and how to identify the places where it's stored, the places where it's used, and the places where it's transported are all key things that each community should be doing today to prepare for this eventuality of having a problem with a hydrogen vehicle or transport system. With that said, if they can just focus in on understanding what they can see and what they can't see, knowing that they can't smell anything either, so they're not going to get that early warning of a smell from somebody on a 911 call. And remember that thermal signature is not as good as we get with others. So if they understand those things and understand where it is, then they'll know that they're going to have to get in much closer and get that thermal out really quickly to figure out where the problem is.
Dr. Baxter, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and for helping translate the science behind hydrogen into actionable consideration for first responders. Today's episode reinforces a simple truth. As new energy technologies like hydrogen emerge, responder safety depends on understanding the hazards and being prepared to respond. Hydrogen offers real benefits, but only when its risks are understood and managed. Thank you for listening to the Hazmat Files. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, stay trained.